We've seen the news stories, bath salt deaths, K2 overdoses, as there's been an influx of kids in recent years into ER rooms, clinics, and treatment programs across the country for the abuse of prescription and over-the-counter drugs. In reaction, there's been a wave of restrictions as these drugs are pulled from store shelves and age restrictions placed on top of them. The feds have even acted on an international level as they've begun to crack down on internet pharmacies. So the question is, are these stories accurate? Or are they sensationalized? Well, to answer that, let's look at the statistic. An important stat we may consider is what percentage of all drug use does this constitute? This is actually answered in a study that's often cited in these stories, put out by the DEA in 2012. In it, it says that 6 out of the top 10 drugs abused by high school seniors are prescription or over-the-counter drugs. That would actually seem that there is an area for concern. But let's look at those stats a little closer. Firstly, it's only seniors, not all teenagers, and there's quite a large gap between marijuana, the top, and the number 2 drug. So we might need to ask a more comprehensive question. What is the percentage when all substances are considered and all teenagers? And we can actually find that in the study where the DEA got those statistics, called Monitoring the Future, or MTF. The MTF is much more comprehensive. You see that it also contains alcohol and cigarettes. So let's go ahead and highlight the categories that contain prescription and over-the-counter drug. When we do that, you see that up at the top, alcohol, cigarettes, and marijuana still hold the lion's share of abuse by teenagers. But if we were to stack all the categories that have prescription and over-the-counter drugs in them, we see that it is something that we should still be concerned about. So what does the MTF have to say about prescription and over-the-counter drugs? Well, in their summary, they conclude this. The use of most of these drugs has either leveled or begun to decline in the past few years. This hardly sounds like an epidemic. So where could this epidemic perception be coming from? Well, the MTF actually goes on to explain why, saying psychotherapeutic drugs now make up a larger part of the overall U.S. drug problem than was true 10 to 15 years ago. Because use increased for many prescription drugs over that period, meaning more prescriptions were prescribed, making them more available. And secondly, in part because the use of a number of street drugs has declined substantially since the mid-1990s. So what this is essentially saying is that over the past 10 to 15 years, while teen drug use has declined, what is changing more dramatically is the type of drug that teens have used. As illegal drugs became more and more scarce, demand was still there, so it got filled in by what was more readily available, which was legal drugs. So I guess the question is, should we be concerned? I mean, these drugs, after all, are legal, which means they contain known ingredients, which are manufactured by pharmaceutical companies, which are in turn regulated by the FDA. So should we be concerned? Well, in short, yes. Take a look at this graph by the OAS, or Office of Applied Studies, which is a division of SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This graph is actually the composition of an average day's admissions to the ER for teens. And what we see up at the top is that alcohol and marijuana once again make up the lion's share of admissions, which roughly is proportional to that percentage of use graph we saw earlier. But down at the bottom half is where prescription and over-the-counter drugs are. And you see that doesn't really match up proportionally to that percentage of use graph we saw earlier. So what that's saying is that while not a large proportion of drug use by teens is prescription and over-the-counter, those teens which are using them are abusing them and doing so in dangerous ways. So what can we do? Let's look back at the MTF study. And what we have here is a composite graph of all substances used by all teens over the past 37 years. And what do we notice? An overall downward trend. So not to sound flippant, but what can we do? Well, more of what we have been doing. So what can we do in our roles? Well, perhaps the most important thing we can do is educate ourselves so that we don't buy into the hype. And there's a lot of great resources that do that, but one of the primary ones is actually the DEA site it's put together for adults and parents called GetSmartAboutDrugs.com. This is actually a great resource that has a lot of information and publications, including the report that we looked at initially, as well as a visual glossary, signs of use, and risks in the home. Now, we can educate ourselves all we want, but ultimately it is the kids making the decision. So we can pass along our accurate information to them when we speak honestly and directly. Because if the kids have the knowledge, then they have the power to make their own informed, Smart choices.